Have you ever wondered what happens when justice forgets the very people who bled to defend it? Picture this: a war veteran leaning on crutches, standing under the cold rain, eyes locked on Renford Hall Courthouse, the place about to demand he stand tall, even though his legs have never been steady since the day he came home. But this isn't just a story about a man falling down. This is the story that brought an entire nation to its knees beside him. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit subscribe on Mr. Max Stories, share this video, and drop a comment below. What do you think true justice really looks like? Now, let me take you to the moment when everything changed. Maxwell Grayson, 38 years old, a veteran of the Black War, huddled under the icy rain at Bramblewood Junction Station. The old tin roof clattered above him, raindrops drumming on his crutches, and the faded uniform he guarded like a treasure. Across the street, Renford Hall Courthouse loomed faintly through the curtain of rain, the building that today demanded his presence, not because of any crime, but simply because he had failed to answer 3 summons. A bus pulled up nearby, but he only watched it go. No ramp, no handrail. Climbing aboard was impossible. Maxwell's breath was heavy, his grip tightening on the crutch handle as he forced himself upright, pain pulsing in his hip over and over. His swollen hands trembled, old scars puckered across his fingers. But he didn't complain. On the cracked screen of his phone, a message lit up. "You don't have to go, Max. They don't understand you. Sienna." For a brief moment, he closed his eyes and bowed his head. But then quietly, a faint smirk crossed his face. This was never just about those pieces of paper. This was about dignity. Maxwell squared his shoulders, steam rising faintly from his soaked clothes. Every step across the street felt like stepping back through war memories. Comrades falling, endless nights too dangerous for sleep. The promise he whispered over the bodies of the fallen: "If I survive, I will not disappear." And in that exact moment, as a passing car splashed freezing water onto him, Maxwell didn't flinch, didn't curse. He just gripped the crutches harder and pressed forward, his heart pounding heavy with every beat. What he didn't know was that inside Renford Hall, right now, a courtroom was preparing to turn him into a symbol even he could never have imagined. Maxwell Grayson tightened his grip on the crutch as he crossed the rain-soaked threshold of Renford Hall, water dripping steadily from his drenched hair down the collar of his worn frayed uniform. The fabric had long since faded, but every crease, every scuffed thread felt like it carried the names of those he'd lost. The black brace gripped his left leg tightly, each step striking the cold tile floor with a sharp, determined clack. The only sound in a lobby filled with passing, indifferent, sidelong glances that quickly slid away. A small boy darted past, bumping into Maxwell and sprawling to the ground. Maxwell bent down, struggling to help the child up, his rough, trembling hands straining as his whole body threatened to collapse from even that small motion. "I'm sorry, sir," the boy murmured. Maxwell gave a faint smile, shook his head, and placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "It's all right, kid. Up you go." A tiny moment, but the sparkle in the boy's eyes was a light Maxwell hadn't seen in any adult's face all morning. He straightened up, a sharp jolt of pain tearing through him, his breath ragged. A security guard shot him a glance, frowning with irritation, as if Maxwell were an obstacle in the hallway. Drawing a deep breath, Maxwell forced himself forward. In his pocket, an old letter from a fallen comrade, folded so many times the edges were worn thin. "If you make it out, don't disappear." He repeated those words silently in his mind, using them to steady his heartbeat, to remind himself, today he wasn't just here to stand trial. He was here to prove that even when society turns its back, a soldier doesn't give up. And somewhere deep inside, a flame still burned. Not out of anger, but out of belief. That a single small act, a trembling step forward, could be the start of changing everything. Maxwell pushed open the heavy courtroom doors of Renford Hall, the rhythmic tap of his crutches echoing beneath the towering vaulted ceiling. He drew a deep breath, his chest aching sharply, but his eyes never wavered from the high bench where Judge Celeste Whitaker sat. The famously cold-eyed judge, her gaze sharp as a blade slicing through any defense before it was even spoken. Step by step, Maxwell made his way to the defendant's stand, cold sweat tracing a line down his spine. He knew he wasn't supposed to speak much, knew every word was weighed against him, but he couldn't stay silent. He tried to explain, to tell them about the 3 missed court appearances, the broken elevator, the bus without a ramp, the whole system that never seemed to think of people like him. But Celeste merely raised an eyebrow, her voice flat. "You made it here today, didn't you? That means you can do it." Maxwell froze. In that instant, the memory slammed into him like a hammer. The image of comrades falling under roadside bombs, the way he had screamed their names but couldn't run to save them. And now, standing before a room full of strangers, he couldn't even save himself. A tight, crushing knot seized his chest. He glanced around. Prosecutor Jasper Whitmore shook his head in weary impatience. The gallery murmured, jurors glanced at their watches. No one truly looked at him. The man who had traded his own legs for the chance at peace, only to now have to ask permission just to sit. Maxwell's fingers tightened on the railing, his breath sharp and uneven, and he whispered, barely audible, "I didn't come here for forgiveness. I came to prove I'm still here." A small sentence, barely heard, but it pulled the room's pulse tight, like a thread drawn to the breaking point. Maxwell swallowed hard as Celeste Whitaker leaned forward, her voice cutting through the room. "To show this court you still respect it, I require you to stand." The room froze. Maxwell heard nothing but the pounding of his own heart. For a split second, his eyes flicked down to his leg, strapped tightly in its brace, the doctor's warning echoing in his mind. If you try to stand unsupported, you may lose the ability to walk altogether. But Celeste's gaze didn't waver. Slowly, Maxwell set his crutches aside. A flash of fear flickered in his eyes. Not the fear of falling, but the deeper, sharper terror of being seen for what he truly was. Fragile. He braced his hands on the table, his whole body trembling with effort. His right leg muscles clenched hard, his left knee buckled inward, his back spasmed in jagged bursts. The sound of his ragged, gasping breath filled the room, making someone in the gallery unconsciously hold theirs. And then, crack, a sharp, sickening snap split the air. Maxwell's legs slipped, his hips slammed hard against the floor, his head clipped the edge of the table, a flash of panic flickering across his face. No one reacted in time. Not a soul moved, except for one voice. "Maxwell!" Sienna Ashford burst forward from the back, her rain-soaked nurse's uniform brushing the cold tile as she dropped to her knees, both hands wrapping around his shoulders. She whispered, her voice thick with tears, "You don't have to do this. You don't have to prove anything to them." And in that slow, suspended moment, when the entire room seemed frozen in place, something unexpected happened. Silas Montgomery, a one-armed veteran, rose quietly from the back row. Then another stood, and another. No slogans, no shouting, just human beings standing, not to demand justice, but to tell Maxwell, without a word, "You are not alone." Maxwell clenched his jaw, sweat beading on his temples, his hands gripping the crutches so tightly his knuckles turned white. He poured every ounce of strength into his trembling muscles, his entire body tensing beneath the weight of his soaked clothes. One deep breath, one determined glance upward, and slowly, shakily, he rose like a fragile blade of grass defying a storm. The room held its breath. No one moved. But then, in the span of a heartbeat, a savage bolt of pain tore through his hip, shattering the fragile scaffolding of his will. Maxwell's knees buckled, his hands shot out to catch the edge of the table, but it slipped. His body crashed hard onto the cold marble floor, the thud echoing through the courtroom. For a moment, no one stirred. Celeste Whitaker blinked, a flicker of something flashing in her eyes. But her lips remained pressed in a thin, hard line. Maxwell lay there gasping, his cheek against the freezing stone, the skin of his palm scraped and bleeding. He couldn't see it, but the gallery saw it all. A small boy and the son of a fellow veteran tugged at his father's sleeve and whispered softly, "Why does he have to try so hard?" The question sliced through the air like a knife, cutting straight into every heart in the room. And then something no one expected happened. Celeste rose sharply from her chair. From the judge's bench, she descended, pulling off her black robe of authority, and knelt beside Maxwell. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, her voice breaking as she spoke. I refuse to represent a justice that turns blind to its people. The room trembled. The soft hum of phone cameras recording filled the air. And in that moment, a wave began to ripple, not just within the four walls of that courtroom, but far beyond, reaching straight into the heart of an entire nation. The snap of camera shutters echoed across the courtroom, but Maxwell heard nothing except the wild, erratic pounding of his own heart. His vision blurred, his hands strained weakly to push himself up. But there was no strength left. Suddenly, a familiar pair of small, determined arms wrapped tightly around him from behind. Sienna Ashford, his sister, the nurse who had stayed up countless nights tending to him in the hospital, broke through the rows of benches without a care for the dozens of eyes on her. She dropped to the cold marble beside him, clutching him fiercely. Her voice trembled, thick with tears. Maxwell, you don't have to prove anything. Not to anyone. Maxwell gently squeezed her hand, a faint, trembling smile flickering across his pale lips. But in his eyes the torment still burned. And then, unexpectedly, he whispered, Sienna, if I don't stand, others like me will stay buried. In that moment, a soft clink echoed from the back rows. Silas Montgomery, Maxwell's old veteran friend, slowly rose. His steel prosthetic leg tapped solidly against the floor, a crisp, unyielding sound. Then another man stood, another veteran, and then another. Within seconds, nearly the entire back row was on its feet. A breathtaking twist unfolded. No one gave a signal. No one called for it. And yet together they all turned their gaze towards Celeste Whitaker, the judge still kneeling at Maxwell's side. Her eyes shimmered, red and glassy with unshed tears. For the first time, the courtroom was no longer a place of cold law and hard rulings. It had become a space where human beings stood for each other, where no defense was needed, only presence. The entire room fell into a hush. Outside, the rain still fell, but inside, a fire had been lit. Silas Montgomery drew a deep breath, his storm-gray eyes shining with a pain words could never capture. He shifted forward on his prosthetic leg, his half-arm lifting steadily into the air. All around, 1,000 held breaths caught tight, the packed courtroom sinking into a single, suspended heartbeat. Maxwell Grayson, still lying on the cold floor, felt his vision blur with tears. He had never asked anyone to stand for him, yet here they were, one by one, without a word, rising. Jasper Whitmore, the blind veteran, rested a hand on Silas's shoulder and gave a solemn nod. Felix Harrington, who'd lost a leg in an overseas campaign, gripped his cane with trembling fingers, pulling himself upright, his eyes burning with quiet resolve. None of them were whole. None of them were untouched. But in that moment, they became something unbreakable. And then, the heart-shattering twist no one expected. A small boy, Maxwell's son, broke free from the gallery, rushing across the courtroom and throwing his arms around his father, his face streaked with tears as he whispered, "Daddy, you don't have to prove anything to me." A hush swept through the room, soft sobs rippling across the gallery. Strangers, officials, onlookers, all turned their eyes, glistening with tears, toward that tiny family circle on the marble floor. There was a pause, a breath, a stillness, and then it burst. Like a wave breaking loose one by one, people began to rise. No one stayed seated. No one just watched. The courtroom, once a place of judgment, had transformed into a sanctuary of restored dignity, a space where scars found their voice. And for the first time in years, Maxwell Grayson no longer felt alone. The air inside Renford Hall courtroom grew thick, not with anger, but with a slow, rising tide of shame. One juror, Isla Harrington, a single mother, slowly rose to her feet, her hand clutching the little badge her young son had given her that morning. She said nothing, simply locking eyes on Maxwell Grayson, lying breathless on the cold marble floor, then shifting her gaze to Judge Celeste Whitaker. And then another. Rowan Whitmore, old and silver-haired, placed a trembling hand on the bench, pushing himself up, his eyes rimmed red. One by one, without a single shout or command, people began to rise. As if their silence alone whispered, "We see you. We know what you've endured." Celeste, the judge known for her unshakable coldness, trembled slightly at the corner of her mouth. And then came the most unexpected twist of all. She stepped down from the bench, slipped off her black robe, set it gently on the chair, and walked toward Maxwell. She knelt beside him, her voice rough and cracking as she whispered, "I can no longer represent a justice that refuses to see its people." The room fell utterly silent. Somewhere, a quiet sob broke the stillness. Then another, and another, spreading through the space like ripples. Even the bystanders, those who had come only to watch, stood and bowed their heads. Not out of respect for the law, not out of fear, but because, for the first time, they were witnessing a raw and undeniable truth. That honor doesn't live in speeches or medals, but in the moment when you look into the eyes of someone who has fallen and choose not to turn away. And at the heart of it all, Maxwell, exhausted, tears falling freely, whispered softly, "I don't need them to kneel. I just need them to stand with me." Vivian Carver, her silver hair framing a frail, thin figure, but eyes burning with fierce resolve, slowly rose amid a courtroom still suffocating under the weight of emotion. Step by deliberate step, her cane tapped softly against the tile as she made her way to stand face to face with Judge Celeste Whitaker. "My father fell in the Korean War," she began, her voice rough but steady. "He has no grave. Only a battered medal was sent home. And today I stand here watching another soldier humiliated in his own country, in front of this law, simply because he no longer has the strength to stand." The entire room froze. Every breath seemed stretched tight. Maxwell bowed his head, his shoulders trembling, not from pain, but from sheer crushing helplessness. Celeste clenched her hands tightly together, her face locked in a battle between hardened authority and the small, sharp crack now opening in her heart. Vivian raised a worn old medal high in the air, her voice trembling as it rang out. "If this is how this country remembers its sacrifice, then I'd rather throw this to the ground right now." And without warning, she let the medal fall. The soft clink of metal hitting the floor rang out cold and sharp, echoing across a room packed with people but swallowed in silence. That moment, that twist, cut straight through the mask of the courtroom. An elderly woman, carrying the weight of a family's war legacy, chose to cast aside the symbol of honor itself to proclaim a simple truth: that people deserve to be treated with humanity, not hollow ceremony. Maxwell lifted his head, his tear-blurred eyes meeting Vivian's steady gaze. And in that fleeting heartbeat, neither of them, not Maxwell, not Vivian, felt alone anymore. Celeste Whitaker, the judge renowned for her unshakable, ironclad rulings, suddenly bowed her head, her hands reaching up to slip the black robe of power from her shoulders. The entire courtroom held its breath. A faint metallic chime rang out as the judge's badge slipped from her hand, clattering softly to the floor, rolling once before coming to rest near Maxwell Grayson's feet. Maxwell, still lying there, his breath faint and ragged, could barely comprehend what was unfolding. Celeste stepped down from the bench, her heels striking sharp, urgent beats against the marble floor, each footfall echoing through the tense, silent chamber. For a moment she paused, lifting her gaze to the gallery, her eyes meeting faces lined with age, scarred by war, filled with quiet, aching expectation. And then Celeste knelt, a stunning twist that left everyone frozen. The woman once known for her cold, unforgiving sentences now placed a trembling hand on Maxwell's shoulder, her voice shaking but resolute. "I have let blind justice become the mask for fear and selfishness. But human dignity doesn't live in this robe. It lives here, where I kneel." A single tear slid down her cheek, landing softly on Maxwell's trembling hand. And in that instant, the courtroom seemed to shatter, filled with muffled sobs, scraping chairs, and people choking on words they couldn't even form. In that moment, there were no more judges, no more defendants, no more witnesses. There were only people, facing each other through pain, through shame, and through the faint, flickering hope that maybe, just maybe, true justice could begin with humility. The moment Celeste Whitaker knelt before Maxwell, Grayson didn't stay confined within the four walls of Renford Hall courtroom. Somewhere in the back, an intern, quiet, unnoticed, had lifted a phone and captured every second. Within hours, the image of Maxwell trembling on the marble floor, his dazed eyes fixed on the judge's hand resting gently on his shoulder, was sweeping across America. Social media exploded. Hashtags surged into trending. Number dignity not forgotten. Number forgotten heroes. Number the kneel for justice. That evening, news anchors, their voices cracking, aired the footage nationwide. Viewers wept as they watched the famously unyielding judge bow her head, openly admitting fault before a disabled veteran. But there was something no camera crew, no headline, no viral post captured, except for the few who had been there in person. While all the lenses focused on Celeste, Maxwell was quietly, desperately reaching for the crutch that had fallen just beyond his grasp. His hand trembled, too weak to pull it closer. That's when a small boy, sitting at the very back, slipped forward unnoticed. Without fanfare, without a word, the boy picked up the crutch and gently placed it into Maxwell's hand. It was a small act, so small, no one on the evening news caught it. But when Maxwell looked at the boy and offered a faint, exhausted smile, those present understood. It wasn't the dramatic kneeling or the viral headlines that truly held us upright. It was this, the quiet kindness, the unnoticed hand reaching out, the silent choice to help, that rewrote the larger story. That secondary clip began circulating too, not because it was flashy or dramatic, but because it reminded everyone. In a noisy world, it's the smallest hands that can quietly reshape the biggest truths. In the days following the seismic kneel at Renford Hall, America reeled. But the most unexpected shift wasn't in the thousands of shares or the breaking news alerts. It began in the smallest places, where veterans of every race, students, teachers, and everyday people sat down face to face to wrestle with a question that seemed simple, yet had rarely been dared aloud. Where does true respect begin? At a small high school in Bramblewood, a history class paused its lesson to watch the viral video. A white student asked bluntly, "Do we look down on them because they're disabled, or because they're black, or because they're poor?" His usually quiet black classmate spoke up for the first time. "Maybe it's because we've never really bothered to look." On live television, Felix Harrington, a white veteran who had once opposed protest movements, choked up, confessing, "I used to think I understood the word dignity, but I've never once knelt down and asked someone else what it meant to them." Amid the roaring waves of media and public debate, Maxwell chose silence. He turned down every interview request, every donation check, every round of applause. Instead, he sent a single handwritten letter to the community. "If I leave behind anything, let it not be the image of me collapsing or others kneeling before me, but the moment we truly looked into each other's eyes and actually saw one another." That quiet moment, not flashy, not loud, planted a seed of change that no one saw coming, a change that quietly and powerfully began in the heart. While the entire country buzzed and debated, Jasper Whitmore, the famously tough prosecutor, sat alone in his office, the soft yellow lamplight spilling across unfinished case files. No one demanded his resignation. No one waved protest signs outside. But Jasper knew the nation had seen the silent bow he hadn't made that day. On the corner TV, the final news broadcast about the case echoed faintly. A nation awakened. Jasper switched it off, slipped on his coat, and quietly left behind a single resignation letter on his desk. Just 4 shaky words. "I have failed." What no one knew was that, before walking away, Jasper had made one last stop. He stood outside Maxwell's hospital room, watching silently through the glass. Inside, Maxwell slept, his hand tightly clutching an old photograph, a picture of fallen comrades from some faraway battlefield. Jasper didn't knock, didn't step in. He simply left a small card at the door with a handwritten note. "Thank you for reminding me who I once was." In that moment, the deeper layers of Jasper emerged. Not a villain, not a heartless man, but someone who had gone blind under the weight of the very system he'd served. A man who, at last, dared to step back, not out of fear, but from the painful realization that true justice doesn't live inside win-loss files, but in how we face ourselves. And in a twist no one saw coming, it was Jasper's quiet withdrawal, his lone act of surrender, that ignited public reaction more fiercely than anything else. No one had expected it, but everyone understood. Real change begins when the powerful dare to admit they were wrong. Late at night, in apartment 5C at Cedar Crest, Maxwell sat alone, his trembling hands carefully opening a battered old wooden box. Inside were yellowed letters, a tarnished silver medal, a chipped military ID card. But what caught in his throat was the letter from Thomas Vega, the comrade who had given his life to save Maxwell's on the battlefield. Max, don't carry this guilt like a badge. Don't go silent. Don't disappear. Maxwell's voice cracked as he read the words aloud, each syllable breaking apart and folding into the sound of rain pattering softly against the window. Clutching the letter to his chest, he tilted his head back, blinking furiously, struggling to hold back the flood of tears. And then, a knock at the door. Sienna, his sister, stood there with a box of cold takeout and an unspoken look in her eyes. She sat down beside him, quietly laying a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to carry all of this alone," she whispered, and the weight of the moment shattered the silence between them. Suddenly, Maxwell reached for his old notebook, flipping to the first page. With deliberate care, he wrote, "I will tell our story, not for himself, but for those who had fallen, and for those still fighting." In that moment, a twist, gentle but profound, unfolded. The man who had once borne the crushing burden of silence was now the one choosing to give it a voice. The story was no longer his alone. It had become a living promise to a generation, a thread of hope woven from the deepest wells of regret. Maxwell sat alone at the old wooden table, the soft glow of a yellow lamp spilling across the edges of a weathered journal. His hand trembled slightly as he gripped the pen, but his eyes burned with a fierce light. Slowly, carefully, he wrote, "I promise to carry the memory of my brothers with me for life, never letting them slip into the shadows of forgetting." Each stroke of ink etched itself deep into his heart, pressing against scars that had never truly healed. Suddenly, the faint jingle of wind chimes sounded outside the window. Maxwell looked up, just in time to see an old photo slip from the shelf. He picked it up, a picture of his entire unit, standing in the dust of the battlefield, Thomas Vega grinning wide, his arm thrown easily over Maxwell's shoulder. His throat clenched tight. Without thinking, Maxwell set the photo in front of him, raised his hand in a military salute. Despite the sharp shooting pain in his left shoulder, where a bullet had once torn through, a subtle, heart-piercing twist. Maxwell wasn't just making a promise for himself. In that quiet, aching room, he was speaking to the soul of someone long gone, turning the silence around him into a sacred bridge between two worlds. In that moment, Sienna stood silently behind him, tears slipping down her cheeks. She understood. He had found his strength not in a body broken by war, but in a love that refused to die between those who had once fought side by side. And the audience, the one hearing this story now, suddenly realized sometimes the most important promise isn't the one you make to the world, but the one you make to your own heart. In the early morning, a thin veil of mist blanketed Maplevale Memorial Grounds, the cold sharp enough to pierce straight to the heart. Maxwell and Sienna walked quietly along the stone path, surrounded by rows upon rows of grave markers stretching into the fog. In Maxwell's hands, a bundle of vivid red poppies trembled slightly with each uneven, limping step, his gait blending softly with the rustling whisper of the wind. They stopped before 4 headstones: Bobby, Marcus, Angela, JT, 4 names etched deep in memory, 4 fallen comrades whose sacrifice had carved Maxwell's path home. He knelt slowly, calloused hands shaking as he laid a poppy before each marker. "This isn't a memorial," he murmured, his voice rough and tight. "This is a promise." Sienna gently squeezed his shoulder, tears slipping freely down her face. Suddenly, a small boy, wearing a t-shirt that proudly read, "My dad's a hero," darted past, pausing without hesitation to bow his head briefly toward the graves. That small, unexpected twist struck Maxwell like a fist to the chest. He realized in a sharp breath that the memory of his comrades didn't live only in him. It had already reached into the hearts of a generation who had never even known their faces. He managed a faint, wavering smile, pressing his hand softly to each carved name, whispering, "Brothers, we're not gone. We're teaching the kids what honor really means." The scene lingers there, holding on the moment Maxwell lifts his gaze to the gray sky, his eyes glimmering with a fragile but unmistakable hope. The belief that their sacrifices, though nameless to the world, would never ever be forgotten. One late afternoon, beneath the glass dome of the Capitol, sunlight streamed through paneled windows, casting delicate patterns across the tense faces of those waiting below. Maxwell sat in the front row, hands gripping tightly onto Sienna's. On the towering screen above, the words appeared, Bill number 428, protecting the dignity of disabled veterans. His heart pounded, memories crashing back. The courtroom at Renford, the place where he had collapsed, the place where an entire system had once made him feel small. The sharp crack of the gavel echoed. "The bill is passed," the speaker announced. Sienna burst into tears, her shoulders shaking. But Maxwell didn't cry. He only closed his eyes as a single tear slipped silently down his cheek, carrying with it the weight of years of humiliation, struggle, and quiet endurance. And then, an unexpected twist. A group of young law students rushed forward, hands extended eagerly. "Mr. Maxwell," one of them said, eyes bright, "your story is the reason we chose to study law." Maxwell stared at them, stunned, his lips trembling as he struggled to find words. But none came. Because it wasn't just a bill. It was the birth of a movement. The scene swept outward. Glimpses of new judge training programs, veterans' rights workshops, posters bearing Maxwell's image. Not as a fallen soldier, but as the man who rose up for everyone else. And over it all, a warm, steady voice spoke. "When one man cannot stand, will an entire society dare to kneel beside him?" A question that lingers, pressing gently but powerfully on the heart, leaving echoes long after the story fades to black. In the lecture hall of Crestwood Law School, a young student stood at the front, her voice trembling slightly as she read aloud. "The Precedent of Maxwell Grayson, 2025. The room was utterly silent, not out of fear of the professor, but because of the weight of the story itself. On the projector screen, the image of Maxwell struggling to stand, collapsing before the court, flashed like a blade cutting straight into the conscience of society. Then the professor spoke, not in the usual cold, clinical tone, but with a voice that cracked just slightly. This wasn't just a case. This was a lesson in courage and the cost of silence. For a moment, the professor's eyes glistened red. No one in the room knew he had once served as a reservist, had once watched comrades die, and had long carried the quiet ache of survival guilt. Then, the unexpected twist. A young woman, Cora Ellington, rose to her feet and spoke loudly. "I chose to study law because of Mr. Maxwell." The class turned, startled. What they hadn't known was that Cora had once met Maxwell at the Maplevale Cemetery, where he had told her softly, "Be the one who can change what I no longer have time to." The scene cut quickly, a university library expanding its social justice history section. New lectures titled Grayson vs. Renford, workshops springing up across America. Every story retold, every hand raised in oath, carried a fragment of that same promise, to never let such sacrifices fade into oblivion. And over it all, the narrator's voice whispered gently, "A lawsuit can be won, but a legacy lives forever." The story no longer belonged just to Maxwell. It rippled outward into every heart learning what it truly means to stand up for the vulnerable. Late afternoon bathed Ashgrove Plaza in golden light, casting a warm glow over the newly unveiled bronze statue. A black soldier, kneeling on one knee, clutching a crutch tightly, his gaze lifted toward the sky. The inscription at the base made passers-by pause in silence. "They did not see you, but we see you now, and forever." Maxwell Grayson stood quietly at the edge, wearing no uniform, no medals, just a weathered jacket and tired eyes. Sienna gripped his hand tightly as they watched the crowd gather around the monument. from wide-eyed children to elderly veterans with bent backs. In the middle of the crowd, a little white boy tugged at his father's sleeve, whispering, "Dad, what's that man doing?" The father knelt beside him, his eyes faintly red. "He's teaching the world how to bow for dignity." And in that exact moment, a line of wheelchairs rolled past. Disabled veterans who once had been too ashamed to appear in public. Maxwell stepped forward, shaking hands with each of them, his voice thick with emotion, words of gratitude catching painfully in his throat. Then came the twist. Vivian Carver, the elderly woman from the courtroom, approached quietly. She pressed something small and worn into Maxwell's palm, an old handkerchief, delicately embroidered with the name Thomas Vega, the comrade who had given his life to save him. Maxwell froze, his eyes flooding with tears. The narrator's voice rose, not to close the story, but to invite. A statue is not just to be seen, it is to remind. So the question is, what will you do to make sure that reminder doesn't fade into the crowd? The story wasn't over. It was only just beginning. On the porch of Cedar Crest, the golden light of sunset cast long shadows across the old wooden chair where Maxwell Grayson sat in silence. Sienna Ashford, his sister, brought out 2 steaming cups of tea, the soft mist curling up between them, wrapping the quiet in a warmth that was both comforting and bittersweet. Maxwell gazed into the distance, where rows of small flags fluttered along the fence, each one bearing the name of a fallen comrade. Suddenly, Sienna placed her hand gently on his shoulder, her voice soft but steady. "You know, Bobby once told me, you were the only one who ever made him believe in miracles." Maxwell lowered his head, his eyes shimmering. Then the unexpected twist. Sienna reached into her pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside lay a chipped military uniform button, the one Bobby had kept as his lucky charm. "I want you to have this," Sienna whispered, "to remind you that you're no longer alone." The world seemed to still. A single tear traced down Maxwell's cheek, not just from grief, but from release. In that fragile moment, the audience could feel his heartbeat, hear the trembling in his breath, and witness the quiet shedding of a hardened shell to reveal a man, raw and cracked, but human again. And then the narrator's voice rose, not to command, not to conclude, but to invite. Remember their names. Speak for them. If you're hearing this story, don't let it end here. Share it so even those who can no longer speak are still heard. This wasn't the end. It was a call, a quiet, powerful invitation to carry the story forward. As the last rays of sunset faded over the porch of Cedar Crest, the story of Maxwell Grayson was no longer just the tale of a veteran reclaiming his dignity. It had become a profound reminder of life's deepest truth, that true strength is not found in never falling, but in daring to rise, even if only within your heart after you've fallen. Maxwell had endured losses beyond counting, fallen friends, a broken body, a system that had abandoned him. But what touched listeners most wasn't his suffering. It was the way he chose, again and again, not to let himself go silent. Shaking, battered, pushed to the cold marble floor, he still carried forward the memory of his comrades, the weight of the nameless, and the promise to keep walking. This story reminds us that sometimes the greatest battle isn't out there, it's inside. When we feel small, when we feel hopeless, when the system, society, or even the people we love don't stand beside us. What's left is a choice. Stay silent or speak, give up or keep loving, fade or keep believing. That lesson isn't just for veterans. It isn't just for Maxwell. It's for anyone who has ever felt lost. You are not alone. Every act of courage, every promise kept, every voice raised, they ripple outward. And it's those small, repeated moments, passed forward through time, that truly change the world.